the controlling class is not interested in having people understand this because, first of all, this leads to the causal factors, the understanding of the causal factors about why humanity is in the current conditions that we're in. Many people will have no answer for that. They don't understand the causal factors.
Tonight on History So It Doesn't Repeat.
Welcome back to History So It Doesn't Repeat. Tonight we have a very special topical debate between Tom Willcutts of Hartford, Connecticut. He's a local attorney, and the illustrious Larken Rose here on Skype for the first time in the studio. Welcome, Larken. Welcome, Tom. I think it's going to be a great conversation. I'm really excited. I'm like an audience member with a mic, so if there's something that needs to be clarified, I'm going to jump right in there and ask for a definition or clarification. Otherwise, Tom and Larken are going to act like two adults and have a logical, reasonable conversation about irrational, unreasonable things like authority and government. And we're going to see if we can flesh out the differences. They agree on some things, they disagree on other things. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I'm excited to see what's going to happen.
First of all, I'm an anarchist, in case people don't know me. The more precise term is voluntarist, which means the anarchist part just means I advocate that there be no government at all, no ruling class. Voluntarist is a little more specific. It dictates that all of human society should be voluntary interaction instead of coercion. And in their daily lives, almost everybody agrees with that, but they imagine that government has an exemption from that rule. And that when government does what would be theft, but calls it taxation, that's okay, is what most people think, because they're taught to believe in government and law and authority and taught to believe that the rules are different, that you and I shouldn't attack each other, but government needs to forcibly control us and take our money and organize and plan things and make us go along with the plan. Now, I eventually got to the point where I believed that government was completely illegitimate. A lot of people I know who are anarchists got there by comparing, well, how would society be with one and how would society be without one, and which would be better. That's actually not how I gave up statism entirely. I got there by realizing that just the concept of government, just the idea itself, is inherently self-contradictory. It's provably impossible as a concept. It isn't just that when put into practice, bad things happen. For example, everybody can say, well, yeah, government can be corrupt and people can abuse power. And I got to the position I'm now at by realizing government is abuse of power no matter what it does. Government is corruption no matter what it does, as long as it's government. And so I got to the position that it isn't really even a choice. It isn't, well, do we like vanilla or do we like chocolate? Should we have a ruling class or shouldn't we? I came to the conclusion that there cannot be a legitimate ruling class, and I think I can pretty easily prove that. And one of my favorite things to do, which I think we're going to do here tonight, is using a few basic lines of questioning, take people who believe in government, whether it's whatever flavor it is, democratic, constitutional, republic, dictatorship, socialist, whatever it is, walk through a few questions that demonstrate that the belief in government is always self-contradictory, always contrary to morality and reason, whether it's giant or little and left or right, doesn't matter.
And so there's a lot of the sentiment, a lot of the values I agree with, and I want to make those clear. One of the, I can't help but believe, thinking that a lot of, the anarchists you listen to, a lot of them are very much motivated by the problems with the current U.S. government. And so I'm going to flat out agree that there's a problem there, that it's dysfunctional, there are abuses. And in fact, I think you can easily make a case that the abuses that exist now are greater than what the colonists faced when they decided to, we got to get away from England.
Sure, I think we can all agree on that.
Well, okay. Everyone in this room, perhaps, but
All three of us agree on that.
You know, and I think that one of the things at play at there is this that there's kind of an illusion of self-governance under the current system. That is really this two-party system where both the two major political parties, I think, are hopelessly corrupted. It's not a choice. And it's a mythology, and the mainstream media feeds it, and so it's almost like, you know, pro wrestling, where people think it's real and it's not real. Okay, so, you know, there's the value on freedom, liberty, the non-initiation of force, which Larken and other anarchists emphasize.
What about the contradictory nature of authority, which he had mentioned? Because I think, you know, when people start from, you know, including fallacies and unrealities in their thinking, no matter what, you know, political parties and lobbyists and politicians are out there, you're going to have people not knowing what the truth is when presented with unrealities. They don't have a process to get to that. And that's why Larken's observing there are irrational, illogical contradictions that are being held generation after generation. And did you have a comment on the contradictory nature that he mentioned?
I do. I think we're going to have to flesh that out, because I don't think the word you're using is authority. Okay, you're not. You know, I've listened to the anarchists and read the anarchists, and the system that would replace. In fact, you've made, I think, this point that anarchism doesn't mean you're getting rid of laws. Okay, or you know, things we know often associate with laws, like property and contracts and things like that, right? So the answer is, and you know, you're maybe taking some of the steam out of Larken's line of questions, but you're not getting rid of authority, okay? I mean,
so when I'm talking about authority,
you're going to be establishing a different system.
Because I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page, especially the audience. Because when I'm talking about authority, I'm speaking about the belief that there's no objective truth, that truth and justice are what strong people say it is. It's kind of a utilitarian, pragmatic view where they can make up truth and say it, and because they said it, now it's the truth, instead of going from what exists and juxtaposing that to the unrealities.
Oh, well,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Let me
let the guest
okay.
let the guest chime in.
Can I barge in just for a second? To me, authority is not merely the ability to violently control somebody, because everybody has that to one extent or another. It's defined as the right to do it.
Right.
So the notion of authority is the guy that's allowed to boss us around and take our money. And I'll hand it back to you, but I would say not only will we do away with authority, there has never been authority. What needs to be done away with is the mythology that there can be authority. Right, it isn't that the current regime needs to, fall into the ocean or something. It's that the belief that there can be a rightful ruling class is what's got to go. But
that's the most dangerous.
Okay, so here's where we disagree. Government is an organizational tool that has evolved over time. All right, it is a system that a society can adopt, and it is a sort of organization, and it's a tool, and it's not unlike a gun in that sense. Okay, I mean, you can look at guns and say that over the course of history, guns have predominantly had the impact of facilitating killing, coercion, and oppression. Okay. But I'm pretty confident that Larken's view on guns is that guns is just a tool. It can either do good or bad depending upon who's wielding it. Okay, so what I would say is that government, like a gun, is a tool, and it can be used to defend righteousness and justice or promote oppression and evil. And just like banning guns isn't going to eliminate deciding to ban guns from, if we get together and decide to ban guns, okay, all those who agree with us, anarchists would like all their group to agree to abandon government. So if we all agree to abandon guns, If you ban guns, that just means the good people ban guns, the bad people have them. The good people ban government, then the bad people are going to have government. And, because if you got rid of what you call public government, you're not going to put an end to this organizational tool. You would still have private type governments, okay? And an example of that is a corporation. A corporation is a group of people who get together, investors, and you have shareholders. They elect the board of directors, who then appoint the officers, and they have bylaws, and it's an organizational tool that has become very powerful. All right, so you're not getting rid of that. And I've checked on the anarchists. As I understand it, there's pretty clear agreement that a corporation is a voluntary contractual arrangement. You're not eliminating that. Another organization that is essentially a private government is a mafia. You're not getting rid of that either, okay? So you have these organizational tools that can oppress, coerce, and kill. Now, the question is, how are you going to stand up? One of my questions to the anarchists would be, having gotten rid of the organizational tool of government, which has a history of being able to put together the power to resist these other organizational tools that can do these things, giving up that organizational tool and leaving yourself barren of that, are you going to be able to resist these other such operations? And I see my note here. If you don't think that corporations such as Halliburton, Blackwater,
how much longer?
That's
filibuster do you have here, Willcutts?
Halliburton, Blackwater, Enron. If you don't think they're capable of killing, coercion, and theft and oppression, I think you're being naive. And I think probably the most notable example of that is the British East India Company. That corporation was stronger than most nations. They can run armies and so forth. So, all right, so gets a little bit of it out there.
Go ahead, Larken.
Okay. I didn't want to interrupt your opening statement. A couple quick things. Sure. Corporations only exist because of the state. Now, companies and businesses and organizations can exist, but specifically the idea of a corporation is a state-created entity that has magical special rights that just a bunch of people don't.
You're mistaken about that.
But if you had used the term, no, I'm not, you're a lawyer, corporations are created under law. A company.
Address it. Let him have his say, and then Tom, you can address it.
But if you had said companies instead of corporations, I would have agreed. Yeah, they can be nasty, they can be violent, they can have power. However, to me, the problem is not that, and I say this all the time, the problem does not exist in Washington, D.C., and the solution is not doing something to that thing over there. And a lot of people assume, and for some anarchists it's actually true, a lot of people assume that anarchists want to go take the government and make it not be there. And that's not what I want. I want people to stop hallucinating that the gang of crooks in D.C. has any right to do anything. Because if you look at, you brought up the mafia. The mafia, nobody imagines they have the right to rule. And that hugely restricts the amount of violence they can do. Now, mostly the mafia makes its money off of government-created black markets. Prostitution, gambling, drugs, alcohol, and that was illegal. Because you can't run a gigantic extortion racket if your victims don't believe you have the right to do it and they have guns. Now, in the case of government, the problem is not that there's this big nasty gang. It's that the vast majority of the victims of this big nasty gang imagine an obligation to obey it because they imagine it to be authority. Nobody imagines mafia to be authority. They're big, they're scary, they have the ability to hurt people, the ability to scare people and take your stuff, but nobody thinks it's righteous and legitimate. Nobody calls them government. The problem with government is it's not an organizational tool. It is, by definition, an entity that is imagined to have the right to do things that mortals don't have the right to do, such as steal, and they call it taxation, such as initiating violence, and they call it law enforcement, such as committing murder, and they call it national defense. The problem is not that there's this gang over there and we need to fix that. The problem is that people are imagining the gang to have the right to do things that human beings don't have the right to do, such as initiate violence. And I would use the example when people say, oh my gosh, if there wasn't a government, some other big gang would spring up and beat us up. Imagine, put yourself in the position where, okay, you're the bad guy, and I'm going to give you about 100,000 people, only 2,000 of them are armed. It's your job to rob 100 million people of a huge chunk of what they earn every year. You only have 2,000 armed agents and then a bunch of paper pushers. How would you rob 100 million people? There is only one way you can do it. Call yourself government and dupe your victims into imagining that them handing over their money is paying their fair share for the good of society, and call your gang the IRS. But if the victims of the IRS stopped imagining law and authority and government to be real and just recognized it as a gang of thugs, they could ignore the IRS out of business overnight, because the victims outnumber the perpetrators a gazillion to one. It is only the belief in the legitimacy of the ruling class, the belief that we are obligated to obey it because it's authority. It has the right to rule, we have the obligation to obey. That belief is a lie, and that belief is the entire problem. And when that belief is gone, and sooner or later it will be, when that belief is gone, you don't have to do anything to government. You don't have to go abolish it. You don't have to go vote it out. You don't have to have a revolution. The people simply ignore it. And we could, because we outnumber it and we outgun it by a huge margin. But most of the victims imagine an obligation to obey the gang of crooks in DC. When that changes, the world changes. Until then, revolutions don't do any good. You knock it over, we'll put up another one, because as long as people still believe that government can be legitimate, they'll bicker over who should sit on the throne and what kind of throne it should be, parliament or a Congress or a king or whatever. But as long as they believe in authority, they will set up a new god, it will stomp on them and oppress them to varying degrees, and it'll happen over and over again. When people give up the belief that one man can ever have the right to rule another, it ends, and it ends forever.
Now, before you continue on, Tom.
Okay, sure. Just going to say how much I agree with that, but go ahead.
I think Larken's point is that people feel that they're obligated to authority, and unlike the mob, where they might just be scared into it, people are born into this illusion of government and taxation generation after generation. We didn't voluntarily subscribe to that. I didn't become part of that group and become a citizen because I made an informed decision. I did that because everyone around me was indoctrinated not to ask questions about these sort of things. So I think the asking of these questions, is it okay to not resist things that go in direct conflict with your human needs of survival? And people being obligated to obey authority, not because of any logical presentation of proof, but because they've been indoctrinated into it and said, hey, it's like death and taxes. You know, you just have to vote for these people, and they will put some people in cages because laws create criminals, right? So what would be your response, and what did you think about what he had to say right there?
Well, one of the ways that bad governments stay in power is that the people accept the authority of that government. And that part I completely agree with. And in fact, the United States system has done a masterful job of creating that illusion. Okay, I mean, between the education system, the propaganda, the two-party system, I have described democracy as a more sophisticated and advanced form of slavery, because the slave does not rebel from himself. If you don't know you're a slave, you don't rebel. Okay, so right. We agree, and the view of authority that Larken is deriding. I mean, had the American colonists had that view, they would not have thrown off the British government. Okay, so that the proper thing to do is to resist the authority of an oppressive government. And I agree that I don't think you would need to do that in the United States. I don't think you would need open rebellion. You would just need to not play the game, and the game is going to significantly, they would have two choices. Either it would go away, or they would have to turn to more overt oppression, which I think would be rejected by the people, as we've discussed in the past. But so we agree on that. But so then when Larken says, so then if you get rid of the bad government, it will then be replaced by another bad government, he's just begging the question at that point. Okay, that is the question. The question is, are they all automatically bad, or can you design a government that is worth having? Okay, and that's that's where we disagree.
I think, okay, so there's also the disagreement over terms, because once government is defined as it is, if you want to create something that's not government, that might serve a similar function but be voluntary, or have other, constituents of the first principles with which people in this country, had founded it for a while on first principles and the Constitution and these ideas, wasn't perfect, and we can have a whole other debate about all those founding documents. But there were people under a struggle of tyranny, and they were trying to do something about it. So, Larken, how would you respond?
Well, I was just thinking maybe if Tom could give sort of a quick overview of like the ideal government he'd like to see, and then if I could ask a few questions about it, because I think I can quickly demonstrate that even your ideal government either isn't going to be legitimate or it isn't going to be governed.
What was the second part?
I'm saying that before
you'll find out what the second part is when it happens to you. When it happens to you, Willcutts, because Larken's boxing you in. So let's go with this. I'm excited now. It's on.
Yeah,
if you want to get the general description,
these Jedi mind tricks aren't going to work with these questions.
Yeah, we'll see.
Okay, so what I would say is that government designs to limit tyranny have evolved over time and have improved. Okay, so I mean, you can go back to the King of England, and
you're going to start with
no.
Hold on. But you just said government. Governments, like, individuals started to design some governments, but a government's not a thing that creates other things. So I just want you to be clear, when you start your sentence and you're presenting that, because it's very ambiguous.
Okay. Look, here's what I'm trying to say. Okay. So you have government. The King of England, that was a government, right?
Sure.
Okay, it's a monarchy. Okay. So because of the king's abuses of his power, changes in government design evolved to address those abuses of power. Okay, and an example of that is the nobles didn't like the fact that the king could just tax them whenever he felt like it. So that's one of the major things in Magna Carta. They basically said, no, king, you can't tax us. Taxing will now be done in Parliament. We will decide when there's taxes. You can ask for it. We get to decide. They didn't like the idea of a king's arbitrary justice. Okay, so they said, no. You want to say we violated a law. You want to bring a case against us. It will be tried before a jury of our peers, meaning another nobleman. Okay? And if our peers decide that your case is not valid, or if they decide your law is invalid or unjust, they can acquit. And there's no appeal from a jury acquitting. Okay? So those were two design protections. And then there were some improvements in the American Constitution. So this is an evolving, to me, exercise. Now we've seen 200 years of the American experience. So do I have some design improvements over that? I absolutely do, and I can give them to you if you like. Okay.
Can I do a really quick question and interrupt you? Of these design improvements over the last 200 years, did tyranny get better or worse after the improvements?
No, I'm saying
King George compared to the United States government, which taxes more, which invades more, which does more warmongering.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. What I was going to say, the 200 years, Larken, was the United States government was made a little over 200 years ago, so it's 200 and almost what?
Don't try to do math live on the show.
220, a little over 225. What I'm saying is, now that we have 225 years of the U.S. government in the books, I can improve upon that. I think your question is different. Your question is,
was that an improvement over
was the U.S. government improvement over the king? Right. Okay. So,
I mean, was the end result more tyranny or less tyranny than under King George?
King George didn't have nuclear weapons and bases around the world, did he? I mean, he did have bases.
He also didn't have 40% taxation. He didn't have massive bureaucracies interfering in everybody's life.
Okay. You have to look at who the government is designed for, okay? When the nobles got Magna Carta, it was an improvement for the nobles, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, it's funny because in Magna Carta, it's like they have a clause for these protection of the nobles, and I think they realize, this doesn't sound good. So they said, and freemen have the same rights. Now, they said that, but that wasn't necessarily true, okay? Now, the short answer to your question is, the American Constitution did not have the safeguards in it to prevent it from turning into the type of tyranny that they rebelled against. Okay, so to answer your question,
well, but wait, you still haven't answered the question. Was the end result of the improved system more tyranny or less tyranny?
It was tyranny. I mean, the
more or less.
You're just talking about how good they are at it. All right. I mean,
okay.
Let me put it this way. It evolved. The U.S. experiment has evolved is equally or more effective tyranny than it replaced. I wouldn't say there's two different.
There's also a neglected aspect because the first principles have been changed over time. They infected they brought in the Prussian education system to take out the self-reliance and self-esteem of individuals, which makes them much more malleable and susceptible to authority. Because if you don't know any better, and this person is coming across on the screen and they're a senator or a president or someone in a costume of any variety that's claiming that they can take your rights, you might be very encouraged by the white coat of the doctor to take the prescription and not know any better.
Look, so to answer your question, Larken, the design features that should have been improvements in protecting the people, they failed. Okay. I mean,
and they more than failed.
Well,
they made things a lot worse than they were before they were even.
I don't know if that's true. I think that, there's been advancement.
We have drones, man.
Well, that's an advancement in technology. So that's my point. Okay. So in other words,
advancing technology without having first principles is very dangerous.
Look, Larken, the Bill of Rights has been gutted. Okay.
All
right. So,
it's been gutted in my own house.
Okay. So the Fourth Amendment has been gutted. And a number of other ones. But so there are some design flaws where it failed. Okay, so I would improve those design flaws.
See, here's why I bring it up. There's a lot that came up in the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. I think the Anti-Federalists were right on almost all of it. That is worth bringing up. The concepts behind the First Amendment and the Second and the Fourth and the Fifth and the Sixth and the fundamental principles they talked about, I'm all for. What I want to point out is they then tried to make a limited government. They tried to take those principles, hang on to the concept of government, and create a protector government whose only job, as the Declaration of Independence says, is to protect the rights of the individuals. And what that turned into was the biggest, most violent authoritarian machine the world has ever known. And I point that out because even though they got those principles right, I cannot think of a better example of the fact that limited government is contradictory and completely impossible than the U.S. Constitution. The most limited attempt ever to make a government has made the biggest extortion racket in the history of the world, the biggest war machine in the history of the world, the biggest, most controlling, intrusive bureaucracy in the history of the world, all based on a document that said, we're going to make this tiny little limited, just defensive government. The one thing they got wrong is government.
No.
They got so many principles right, but they left that ingredient in. They left the seed of authoritarianism in. This is what it grew into.
We can disagree on the flaws in that draft. I mean, look, the anarchists look to John Locke as their hero in natural law, homesteading. Well,
all right, so stop with your straw man there. He caught you.
All right.
Don't argue with somebody who.
All right. Well, John Locke is often identified with natural law concepts. That we're all, no man has natural authority over another, that we're all equal in our rights to liberty and freedom, that our rights to property and so forth.
But you're talking about an English philosopher, and the problem is there's an unreality, there's an illusion called authority, and it starts with the fact that if you can understand the words I'm saying, that there is existence, consciousness of existence, percepts, concepts, and logic underlying all of that, and to deny any of those first principles is using a fallacy of a stolen concept.
But you're missing. Let me finish the point.
Okay, go ahead.
The point is that, Locke's ideas were the ideas for replacing monarchy with government by the people.
Sure.
All right. So, and the U.S. Constitution was drafted within decades of his doing that. Okay. It's a first draft, if you like. And the other problem is the debate and disagreement that Larken identifies in terms of the drafting of the Constitution. I think you could identify two forces there. You could identify the wealthy American class that wanted to replicate English rule in America. They just wanted to be the rulers, sure. Okay? And the people who wanted to move forward with this new idea that was used as the rallying cry to the people and continues to be the rallying cry to the people of liberty and freedom. So that was the conflict. And, and the compromise, which is the problem, how these things evolve. The compromise was this stronger central government, which the new freedom, liberty people didn't like. And in order to bring them on board, they insisted on the Bill of Rights. Okay, so that was one compromise. The other major thing at that time, in terms of are we going to replicate England or are we going to be different, was the monetary function of the government or how the monetary function is handled. And they did not, they just left it vague. Okay? They couldn't agree and they left it vague. And that led to the first Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States, and ultimately the Federal Reserve. So, the question is, that I would have for you, Larken, is the government a power unto itself or is someone running the U.S. government? I mean, there's a whole school of thought out there.
You asked a question, you gotta let him answer.
I was just gonna say, there's a whole school of thought out there of the ability of banking institutions to control a currency and then control a government. Is that happening here or no?
Yeah, I think most of what we see is totally a puppet show. Like what we see on CNN is the show put on. I mean, everything from the elections, like you were talking about before, to the House hearings on this or that other bill. It's the show they put on to make it look like that's how decisions get made.
Good. So we agree.
And that's not how any decisions get made.
So good. We agree there. So now the government is a puppet for another force. All right. So then the question becomes, if you eliminate that tool, what have you done to eliminate the force that's wielding the tool?
Everything.
Well,
absolutely everything.
We fundamentally disagree there.
Consider the Federal Reserve.
Okay.
Imagine this. There wasn't a government that people thought had the right to legislate. There wasn't a government that people thought had the right to rule. They didn't imagine it to be authority. They didn't imagine an obligation to bow to it. And along comes this big bank that says, trade with these, please. And people say, oh, that's convenient. And they trade and they say, hey, they're becoming worth less and less. I'm going back to silver. That's the end. Why couldn't they do that? Because the government that people believe in an obligation to obey said, you have to accept this. This is good for all debts, public and private. You must accept this. You can't compete. You can't make your own. And these are all things they fabricated out of thin air. They're not in the Constitution. I think we'd agree on that. But it was the violence of government saying, we're going to, in 1913, we're going to say banks are allowed to lend out money they don't have. It's legal. We have the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 that says they're allowed to do fractional banking, and they're allowed to pretend they have money they don't have, and they're allowed to make up money out of thin air and lend it to us at interest and do all these frauds and scams.
So who's going to stop them?
All you have to do is not use their stupid pieces of paper.
Okay.
But you're not allowed to not use their stupid pieces of paper because of the violence of government. Look at what just happened to Norfed, the Liberty Dollar. They're trying to put somebody in a cage for saying, let's trade with silver instead of pieces of paper. Without that violence, yeah, people can still try fraud. But when people notice the fraud, all they have to do is say, we don't want to use your fraudulent money that we just figured out. You're playing games and it's IOUs based on something that isn't even there. And we're just going to walk away. You can't just walk away when government says you're not allowed to just walk away. This is the money you have to accept. This is the money you're going to use. And we regulate the banks. We control the banks. We say who can be a bank. We monitor everybody's money under the guise of the income tax. We control the money and we control commerce and we monitor it and know all about it by way of government force. But literally, let me see if you agree with this statement. If tomorrow everybody understood the fraud that the Federal Reserve has done and just said, let's just not trade with Federal Reserve notes anymore, and just stopped using dollars, would that or would that not mean an immediate permanent end to the Federal Reserve and the international banking cartel?
No. Absolutely
What would they do if nobody used their dollars? How would they get any power, any money? Nobody borrows it. Nobody trades with it.
He's saying it's the plug to their power. What happens if you pull their plug?